In this video, I'll be discussing the practice of biohacking muscle growth with nucleus overload. By biohacking, I don't mean some advanced DNA manipulation or miraculous scientific procedure. Nucleus overload is a very simple training method that 100% of lifters can understand and make use of, and that guarantees tangible results if applied properly. To start off the video, I'll explain how nucleus overload functions on a molecular level. Then we'll move on to the methodology of training needed to make it work, along with best programming practices. To finish off, I will be outlining in clear details the way to put nucleus overload in practice, both via abstract and concrete examples, to show you exactly how it is to be done. After that comes the conclusion, where I will be recapping the key points to keep in mind so as to not mess up nucleus overload and actually tap into the full potential of this method, which is what made me call it biohacking in the first place in regards to the muscle growth it permits. Enjoy the video. Hello YouTube, today we're going to be talking about nucleus overload. If you're an OG on the channel, you know that almost 2 years ago I made a 4-video series on this very concept. So it's something I've covered already, but back when I did that, I was only starting nucleus overload. I had no personal experience with the practice. And we're now 2 years later, and I've accumulated a ton of empirical evidence that shows that nucleus overload indeed functions, and I know exactly how it functions because I tried it on myself. So I'm coming to you with this information that I want to share because I think that it can make a massive difference in your bodybuilding endeavors. I have come to believe that nucleus overload truly is a way to biohack muscle growth. And we're going to cover exactly why today. For the people who don't know what nucleus overload is, in theory, let me quickly cover it. When you grow the muscle, you have two main ways of doing that, meaning that the muscle can either hypertrophy, so a particular cell within the muscle is going to enlarge, it's going to get bigger, or hyperplasia, where the number of cells is going to increase. In both cases, this leads to muscle growth. Now, I am not one to use these terms in my videos, which is paradoxical because the name of the channel is natural hypertrophy. When I speak about hypertrophy, I don't speak about the scientific term. I speak about the state of growth that any muscle will have to go through, regardless of the way it gets there. Meaning that I'm not going to split hair and tell you exactly that this is the way to get the muscle to grow this way. For me, all of that is nonsense, it's useless. All I care about is whether the muscle is growing or not. For the most part, you will find out in bodybuilding that as long as you're training the muscle, it will grow. Whether it grows through hyperplasia or hypertrophy or hyperplastic or hyper the fuck, no one cares. It's growing, that's all that matters. But for nucleus overload in particular, you have to know that it mainly is going to be an hyperplasia type of training, meaning that you're going to multiply the amount of satellite cells in the muscle via metabolic stress. So for the most part, what you're going to go through with NO, which is the abbreviation I'm going to be using for the rest of the video, is putting the muscle through cycles of stress that don't necessarily break down muscle fiber, but rather causes a type of tension that forces the muscle to adapt through hyperplasia, so through the multiplication of muscle cells. That can come through blood flow, it can come through just overall tension or stress. Again, I don't really care. All I care about is that it works. The science attached to it, if you are a nerd, maybe it's something that you're going to care about, but I can tell you for a fact that even if you don't know the exact way it occurs, it can still work. And that is true for the entirety of muscle growth in particular, meaning that you don't have to know how a bicep works to be able to grow your bicep. Once you know how the technique is applied, you can apply it. After that, the theory is just, again, the cherry on top if it's something that interests you, but it's completely worthless. So science will not be involved today. I'm going to talk about practical, applicable things, okay? We're not going to jerk ourselves off on book pages. We already do that with philosophy. We don't need to do it again with science. So, for me, my personal experience with nucleus overload is 1.5 years with the lats, so I've been running Nucleus overload for my lats for almost 2 years, and 6 months for the calves. The reason why I was late on the calves is because I had my doubts on Nucleus overload, meaning that I knew it worked, but I didn't understand how much it worked. And now that I've seen the result with my lats, I am convinced, I am bought and paid for, I will be running NO for every single one of my muscle groups that need to catch up. So for me, it's lats, calves, forearms, triceps. These are the ones that I'm going to focus on because I know it's going to function. Since I believe NO to be the solution to blow up a small muscle group. If you have a small muscle group on your body that is lagging behind, you want to listen to this guide because it's going to make a massive difference. I do believe that if you run NO properly, you are going to see results. Now, understand that these are my methods. I know that some people have already spoken about NO. Even the term nucleus overload was pioneered and christened by someone else. I don't care. I like the name. It sounds cool. So I'm going to stick with it. But the way I present it to you is my methods, okay? I don't give a fuck if someone else does it differently. I'm going to tell you the way I did it and it worked. So I think it's going to also work for you. So let's get into it. As I said, NO is for all those small muscles that you never can quite get to the level that you want them to be at, for the most part because you never really find space to put them in your program. And that is something I've always found. Most of the time when someone has a lagging muscle group, it's not that they work it and nothing happens, it's that they cannot find enough spaces in the program so as to work it enough for it to grow in the long term. That is mostly the case for most people. And the beauty of NO is that it's going to allow you to do that. But you have to understand one thing. We're not going to be doing that through intensity because unless you're a complete moron, if you have a muscle group that cannot grow, I expect that you have tried in the past to train it properly, meaning with hard sets, that you've actually tried to apply a proper philosophy of hypertrophy, meaning that you've tried to put tension on the muscle so as to break muscle fiber or create a reaction by the muscle. If you didn't do that, you most likely fall into the category of someone who is a novice and has no use for this video. But if you have tried everything and nothing worked, NO is going to help you because for those muscle groups, it's going to be much more effective to use volume and frequency as variables of growth rather than intensity, because intensity, yes, functions and yes, is essential, but sometimes is not the end or be all to muscle growth. And nucleus overload proves that. So when you do NO, what you're essentially doing is volume accumulation without any regards for intensity, which is, again, shocking because I do promote intensity, and here I'm telling you that we're going to do without it. Does it mean that NO exists outside of the range of intensity? No. Every single movement you do in the gym has an intensity, but we don't have to keep an eye on it for NO. It's completely irrelevant because we're going to keep it so low that it doesn't matter. This is the first key take that you have to keep in mind. Nucleus overload is done in irrelevant intensity windows. The intensity needs to stay super low. So in a sense, what we're going to do is we're going to do junk volume. Nucleus overload is not quality volume. And if it becomes quality volume, it's not nucleus overload anymore. This means that when you do nucleus overload, you will not go to real failure. What I mean is that you never want to get to a point where you cannot get an extra rep. You never want to get to a point where you cannot get 5 extra reps, because if that is the case, it means one of two things. One, you did way too many reps. 2, you selected a weight that is way too challenging, so you got to failure within a very small amount of reps. In both ways, you have fucked up. What you are doing is not nucleus overload. You never want to be stopped by failure when you do NO. You stop yourself. You are going to send back the fuck out of every single set. That is the point. And the reason why we want to do that is because since the intensity window we're going to select for nucleus overload is irrelevant, you trying to go to failure within the irrelevant intensity window is worthless, because even if you did get to failure, one, it takes way too many reps. Try to go to failure at 35% on an isolation, and 2, the reps that you're getting close to failure and until failure mean almost nothing because they're still junk volume. Even if they're higher intensity than the one prior, they are still low quality volume. So it doesn't matter that you got an extra 10 reps close to failure. It is not the point. You missed the point. On top of that, you are going to waste a ton of time with these additional reps that we don't want, because this would be treating nucleus overload as if you are doing a hard set, or you want to seek reps that get you close to failure. With NO, we do the exact opposite. We want to stay away from failure, because failure doesn't matter, because even again, if you got to failure, it wouldn't result in anything beneficial, because every rep you're doing is low quality volume in the first place. I just want to tell you right now that if you're a bit confused by what's going on here, keep in mind that at the end, I'm going to give a practical guide of how to apply it. Right now, we're covering the theory, but understand that after the theory always comes, again, the application. And I'm going to tell you for each muscle group what I expect you to be able to do so as to apply nucleus overload. So let us keep going. Why is NO so great? NO is great because it is time efficient, okay? It is... Never mind, okay. NO is cost efficient, sorry, it's not time efficient. What does it mean? It means that in terms of expenditure of energy, NO is really low. It's not going to take much out of you, and that is the beauty of it. That's the reason why it is so great. It's not going to take away from the rest of the program. Meaning also that you can budget your program with in mind the idea that you are not going to have to amount NO in the balance. The rest of the hard sets will not be impacted by NO. So that's the cost efficiency of the practice. The issue is that it's not time efficient. And it's the reason why also we don't want to go to failure, because it would make it even less time efficient to do that many reps. NO is going to take a lot of time because it's a lot of reps and it's a lot of sets. So of course, it's a lot of time spent moving, and many people would tell you that it's a lot of time wasted because you're doing irrelevant intensity windows. The thing is that we are going to find places in the program where nothing would usually occur and we can plug NO. And what is that? Supersets. So we're going to look at spaces in the program where you usually sit on your ass, and we're going to have you do NO. Why? Well, it's simple. NO, again, doesn't fatigue the muscle. NO doesn't fatigue the cardiovascular system. NO barely touches the CNS. So it doesn't matter whether you sit on your ass or you do NO. At the end of the day, nothing is occurring during that time period, so you might as well do something. This is essential. NO is never ever programmed as an actual straight set, ever. It's always a superset. And I would go even as far as to say that when you program, you have to program NO as a separate entity. You're not programming NO as another exercise, even if you do exercise with high volume, because even these would still go close to failure. NO needs to be programmed, again, as a different beast altogether, because it is a different beast. Now, the important part, and the one to keep in mind here, is that NO is mostly going to be used for small muscles. It's not an obligation, but the way I present it, it's something that I greatly encourage because it's what makes the most sense in terms of doability. The reason for that is simple. A small muscle is usually one that tends to be neglected on compound, which is why so many of you guys who still are good on compounds have small muscle groups, because again, they don't get the amount of fatigue or pressure or tension they should receive from the compounds, because most of the time the compounds prioritize the bigger muscle groups. Small muscles also have a lesser work capacity, which also means that you can work them on a daily basis, knowing that you won't have to spend too much time on them because they don't have, again, much ability to work. So if you do NO and you don't actually go to failure, it doesn't really matter, even with a low intensity, because the muscle that you're using NO for doesn't have much of an ability to handle that type of work regardless. And it's something that you will have found out if you do small muscle group work, like biceps, for example. The biceps are not as endurant as the quads, for example, so you burn out quickly and you run out of an ability to do hard sets much faster. They also have a much shallower baseline, meaning that it's much easier to get the muscle into a pre-fatigued or semi-fatigued state, which is what we seek with NO. And they have a faster recovery because of it, because their bucket is smaller, and a smaller bucket of recovery, yes, empties faster, but also fills up faster. So it's easier to frequently work them, and because NO is mostly done through high frequency, It's an NO dream. It's the reason why small muscles work so well with NO. As for big muscles, the reason why they are so inefficient when running nucleus overload cycles is because they tend to be prioritized on compounds, so they accumulate a ton of fatigue by default because they get work from pretty much any polyarticulary movement you're going to do in your training. They have a deeper baseline, so good luck getting them to a semi-fatigued state with NO because they have such an endurance that it's going to be a real bitch to get to that level. Like for example, the hamstrings. Hamstrings are some of the most endurant muscles in the body. If you do NO with it, it's going to be the equivalent of trying to dig a ditch as someone behind you is filling it up at the same time. It's going to be an endless chase. It's the reason why I don't recommend doing NO with big muscles. And also have a worse recovery capacity because, again, if you mess up, if you mismanage, these muscles can quote-unquote burn out because they take a longer time to recover. And since there will be plenty of opportunities for you to fuck up your recovery with NO, we don't want that to happen. Small muscles make it much easier because it's easier to manage the recovery of a muscle with a low work capacity or a low work endurance. I hope that this is clear. Now, I want to make something absolutely crystal evident for you right now. Nucleus overload cannot replace hard sets, okay? Don't make that mistake. I am not telling you that NO is the end-all be-all or the only thing you need for the muscle. It's a complement, right? It would be the equivalent of not eating solid food and only eating supplements. It would be idiotic, so don't do it. You still need your hard sets to be programmed and prioritized at all costs. NO is something that comes afterwards. And when you do NO again, keep in mind these are not hard sets, so it's low intensity. And that low intensity allows us to focus on volume and frequency, which is the bread and butter of nucleus overload. It's the way we program them. Again, we don't look at intensity. Intensity by default is going to be extremely low. But just because intensity is low does not mean that this doesn't count towards tonnage. It still does. But you have to, again, keep in your coconut the fact that it's not going to do much for strength progression. Your nucleus overload should not be programmed with in mind the fact that it's going to carry over to your main compound movements. It is not the point. The point is pure hypertrophy. So you have to regard nucleus overload for what it is. A type of fatigue that is going to be hyper-biased towards small muscle groups through isolation that cannot be programmed with in mind the fact that they are going to replace hard sets or strength work because it won't. But it's still tonnage. I say that because too many people look at nucleus overload and think, oh, it's bullshit, either because of the name that sounds a little bit hocus pocusy, or because they have heard someone else say, well, NO is bullshit. If you tell me that nucleus overload is bullshit, you're telling me that moving a muscle through space with resistance does nothing for hypertrophy. What is true is that the type of work is not as effective as high intensity work, but it's not ineffective. All fatigue, if recovery is managed properly, will lead to growth. Nucleus overload is no exception. So yes, it works. But the second you start to only do it with no hard sets, that is when it loses its purpose because you're training 5,000 pounds for like 500 pounds of shitty quality tonnage and you're thinking that it's going to lead to growth. It's not going to work, or at least my example was poorly chosen, and I think you understand that. It would be more like trading 3,000 pounds of high quality tonnage for something like 4,000 pounds of low quality tonnage, thinking, hey, I won 1,000 pounds in the exchange. Well, yeah, but it's low quality tonnage. And if you go through the exchange rate, you will find out that your 4,000 is only really worth 400. So something to keep in mind. So the question of carryover is not going to take place here. We don't care about the carryover. And this also means that you shouldn't expect to put weight on the bar too often. It's a mistake I see people make with NO. It's a mistake I made myself. I tried to progressively overload the way everyone does, threw weight on the bar, and then I realized that it was a mistake because it was transforming the practice into hard sets. You're going to put weight on the bar and just magically the reps are going to get lower and lower, the sets are going to get lower and lower, you're going to start reducing the frequency because you can't recover, and just like that, you have transformed NO into hard sets. This is not the point. We don't want to see that happen. So you will put weight on the bar once in a blue fucking moon and it doesn't matter because you will progressively overload through volume, not through weight on the bar. It's incredibly important. You will put weight on the bar for other exercises, but NO is going to be ostracized. It's going to be its own thing. And it's incredibly important that you do that. Do not fall for the strength meme. NO is not about strength. You're not supposed to move heavy weight. You're not supposed to go through failure. You have to think about it in terms of muscle bias, not specificity, because NO is a pure hypertrophic practice. I do strength work. Strength work is not purely hypertrophic. It is because of my perspective, I only do it for size. But in general, it's still also biased towards strength gains. Nucleus overload is none of that. It is pure metabolic fatigue. It is pure hypertrophic work. And don't make me say what I didn't say. Metabolic fatigue is not bodybuilding exercises. It's not bodybuilding specific. And if you bodybuild only through metabolic fatigue, you are going to get shit gains. Again, nucleus overload is going to be the thing that complements muscle tension and muscle fiber damage. It doesn't replace it. So you most likely will see almost no progression in terms of weight on the bar on NO, and that's perfectly fine. We are going to grow through other means. Keep in mind, however, that even though I said that, it doesn't mean that you cannot do the same movement for NO or strength work. The only thing is to not mix up the two. For example, for me, I do heavy pullovers with 95 pounds for sets of 12. That is strength work for the pullovers, okay? It's a normal hard set. I do nucleus overload for pullovers with 60 pounds where I do 7 to 10 reps and I don't go even close to failure. It's the same movement with different parameters that creates different results. So you can still use the same movement if you want, but not with the same method. For the people who are going to listen to that and who might still have a doubt in their head thinking, that sounds good and all, but I wouldn't want nucleus overload to have an impact on my hard sets. You are perfectly correct. We wouldn't want that at all, but don't worry about it. As someone with experience on the matter, I can tell you that if done properly, nucleus overload won't hurt your hard set. Only and only if you do it intelligently. And one thing I would tell you to do with NO is do not program NO for a muscle on days where you already work the muscle. Example, if you have a NO cycle for the lats and you have a day where you have heavy chin-ups, don't do your NO for the lats on that day. It's sort of missing the point here. You could do it at the end of the day, but again, why would you do that? You already worked the lats on that day. NO is supposed to take place on days where nothing would usually happen, and you're going to sneak in some easy sets for a specific muscle group. So let's say you have a day where you do presses and you have a space in between presses. Now you can do some nucleus overload for the lats. Now it's going to make a ton of sense. But make sure that you don't end up doing the mistake that I just described. Agonistic muscle groups trained on the same day with hard sets and nucleus overload tend to be suboptimal. If you do it, understand again that it is suboptimal. For example, for me, I do pull-ups with nucleus overload and pullovers with nucleus overload, and I do them both on the same day. Is it optimal? No. I would be better off doing heavy weighted pull-ups on day one and nucleus overload with a different meal for the lats on day two. I don't, because the method I'm doing right now works for me in terms of taste and appetence and preference for me, so I do it, but it's not optimal. And keep in mind also for the people, again, who are afraid that it's going to hurt the hard sets, that one, if you apply what I just said, you'll be fine. And two, since you are very far from being at 100% intensity, nucleus overload doesn't impair recovery or damage tendons, but it does give muscle fatigue. And how does that make sense? Well, if you watch my videos about deload, you will understand it quickly. The bucket of recovery is at 100%. If you take away 2 or 3% of nucleus overload, is it going to kill your performance on hard sets? No, it won't. So you'll be just fine. But if you fuck up nucleus overload and you actually drag the water out with a bigger scoop than you expected, and you take out 10, 20%, then yes, it's going to be a problem. This is why, again, we want to be careful with nucleus overload. We want to always do something that is going to be non-invasive. Nucleus overload is not an invasive practice, but it still gives muscle fatigue. Because if you look at the math, those 2-3% that you're going to take here and there accumulate quickly because it's all volume and it's high frequency. So even though it doesn't look like much on a day-to-day basis, on a yearly basis, it's a shit ton of tonnage, of low quality tonnage, but still a ton of tonnage, which is why it works. It's strength in numbers. It's quality versus quantity. Both are valid, both have their place, but you never want to have only one or the other, and you especially don't want one to cannibalize the other. That would be a mistake. So you want to also watch out for overuse injuries, because even though technically you're not going to damage the tendons with NO, it's still a possibility because it's still fatigue. It can still cause also strength loss if you don't know what you're doing. And the easy way out of this is simple. NO is not a priority. NO is an afterthought. The first thing in your mind should be the hard sets. If they start to suffer, it's because you've started to prioritize NO. So it's a mistake on your part. You don't want the compounds to suffer from NO. The goal of nucleus overload is to tickle the muscle. Some people say annihilate the muscle. Some people say stimulate the muscle. I say that for this practice, you want to tickle it. You don't even want to be even a tiny bit fatigued. You just want to get the work and get out. It should feel like you did nothing. That's sort of the reason why also a lot of people don't like nucleus overload, is that it feels like you did nothing. It feels like fluff, like nothing happened. You just got a pump or even no pump. But that's the point. It's so low in fatigue, it's so not fatiguing at all that you don't even notice it. But at the end of the day, it's going to actually have an impact. It's the equivalent of just digging out a tiny pelt of ground every single day. After a while, it makes a big ass hole. But if you just do it one day and you look at the result and you look at the fatigue it took for you to do it, you'll think, well, nothing happened. Of course, it's a global practice. It's not something that is going to give immediate results. But because, again, it's so minute in terms of fatigue, it allows for a much more precise accumulation of fatigue without all of the potential downsides of fatigue accumulation that you know very well. Loss of strength, inability to progress, inability to actually do the hard sets that you plan for the day. All of that will not happen with nucleus overload, especially because, again, we're going to do it with small muscles. It's the reason why I insist so much on NO being particularly skewed towards small muscle groups. It's because it makes a ton of sense. Since, and you have already understood that by now, we are going to be using single jointed movements for nucleus overload, not compounds. It's going to be isolation only, which makes it much more easier because if you look at compounds again, the issue of compounds is that they will global fatigue, what I call diffuse tonnage. A deadlift is a fucking nightmare to program. It's the reason why so many people hate it. It's because it works a ton of muscle at once, it fatigues a ton of areas at once, and therefore it oversteps its boundaries because now the rest of the program is infected by the deadlift. Like it's like deadlift is on Tuesday. Well, the day before and the day after, you have to keep in mind that you deadlifted on Tuesday, so you have to be careful. And even beyond that, because the recovery aspect on the deadlift is something that many people struggle with. This is true for every single compound. It's the reason why, by the way, when you program for bodybuilding, you program the compounds first and then you program the isolation because the compounds are what takes the most space and what are going to be the most cumbersome. So no compound movements for nucleus overload. Please don't make that mistake. Nucleus overload is the anti-Bulgarian. You do not want to do compounds. If you do it, what's going to happen is one of two things. One, you're going to get injured because you're going to start doing a version of Bulgarian for bodybuilding, which doesn't work because it's going to be mainly skewed towards progression, and that's not the point of nucleus overload. Or you're going to be so pussy about it that you won't get any results at all. So cool, you used compound movements for nucleus overload, and you did it so little that nothing happened. That is not the point. So no compound movements. Isolation movements only, also because they are easier to superset. If you want to sneak an isolation movement in the program, they go anywhere for supersets. Good luck supersetting a compound movement somewhere in the program. Also keep in mind that the reason why we don't like compound movements for nucleus overload is because they tend to be too skewed towards cardiovascular system expenditure, meaning that you are going to get limited by your heart and your lungs. The goal is not to do cardio, the goal is to grow your muscles. So again, no compounds. Isolation movements only with the small muscles that have less work capacity and faster recovery. So again, it's more time efficient. When you're dealing with a practice that is cost efficient and not time efficient, you have to find ways to skew it so as to make sure it's as little time inefficient as possible. And it's via ways I already described. Isolation movements, skewing towards small muscle groups, and never going to failure when you actually do it. Because the goal is time efficiency overall, okay? We don't want to go down the rabbit hole of people who, for example, do NO variations, nucleus overload variations. Like nucleus overload is already a subtract and a subcategory of your training. Why are you then having subcategories of subcategories? This is a mistake. It's treating nucleus overload as straight sets. They are not a priority. They cannot be trained like this. So I tell you to use one movement only per muscle group, one isolation movement only for nucleus overload, two max if you have a lot of experience. And even then, they need to be very specifically related. For example, a lat pull down and something like a pullover. So a lat pull down where you have straight arm lat pull downs. That would be sort of acceptable, but we don't want to waste the efficiency of nucleus overload, because if it stops being cost efficient or as time efficient as possible, it's just going to be a malpractice. Now, let's get into the actual practice of nucleus overload. I spoke to you about the way it's supposed to happen on paper, but that's not enough. I know all of you want to hear how to actually run it. So it's quite simple. For nucleus overload, you're going to pick an isolation movement, all right, that is going to target a small muscle group. You're going to do it frequently for high volume, always far from failure. You're going to make sure that baseline isn't too impacted, so you never want the muscle to get sore or to get really deeply fatigued that it actually damages hard sets. You want, again, to just tickle the muscle. And the best way for that is also to look at the baseline. How repeatable are your sets? If you do, 30 reps of tricep extensions on NO, you better be able for the second set to do 30 reps with no actual effort. It should be effortless. This is the sign that you didn't really go that deep in terms of baseline, that the muscle is still endurant enough for the repeatability of the sets to occur. If you understand intensity, you know that for hard sets, we want the exact opposite. If you can hit 10 reps on the squats on a hard set and the next set you get 10 reps, chances are your first set wasn't as effective as you thought, because the muscle is not fatigued enough to prevent you from getting the same exact number. So your performance did not decrease, the baseline did not decrease that much. It is a misapplication of hard sets, just like it would be a misapplication of NO if you weren't able to repeat the set. You want to schedule NO on days you don't expect to perform hard sets with said muscle, as I said previously. You want to progress preferentially by adding reps and sets, not weight on the bar. The variable that we use for manipulation here is volume and intensity, in priority always. The weight on the bar can occur, but again, it's the last resort. Because we do rep sets, then days, so frequency, then weight. It's actually the pecking order of progressive overload for nucleus overload. It's incredibly important to grasp. We want also to make sure that we don't allow the entire program to morph into an NO fest, what I call an NO fest, where you end up liking it so much that you only do it. Well, now, congratulations, the entire program is just junk volume, so it's entirely worthless. It must be the cherry on top, not the entire cake. I want to stress that. NO is the cherry on top. It should make up a very small portion of your tonnage if we actually take into account quality of volume. Okay, it should be very small. But as we all know, small muscle groups tend to be the ones that require these small details. Again, art is in the details. Bodybuilding is an art, so the details need to be taken into account. A bodybuilder would say fuck it, a powerlifter would say fuck it, ditch the cherry and just add extra whipped cream on top because it makes the cake fluffier. That's not what we do as bodybuilders, so it's the way to go. To make it more flexible, you must sometimes want to program your nucleus overload on as many days as possible, which is again in complete contradiction with compound movements. If you put as many compounds as you can on every single day as you can, you are going to burn the fuck out because every single set of compounds holds a ton of fatigue. The beauty with NO is that it holds almost no fatigue at all. So you can allow yourself to put NO literally every single place that you can actually find a spot. So it will occur on as many days as possible, as many set lines as possible. A set line is a number of exercises that are part of the set. which will allow you for instinctive rotations. What do I call instinctive rotations? Well, instinctive rotations is rotations that don't happen bi-weekly or bi-monthly. They happen when you feel like it. Again, dangerous practice for compound movements, because every time you rotate a compound out of the program, you lose a ton of tonnage, of specificity, etc. But with nucleus overload, it doesn't matter. If you do 4 sets of nucleus overload for, I don't know, the triceps again on Monday, and you just rotate it out, you didn't lose much. It's not a problem, especially because it can rotate back in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So you will always find a place in the training to get your nucleus overload done, and that's exactly what we want. These are small muscle groups that are often neglected by you. Why are they neglected? Because you find them to be an inconvenience when it comes to working them. I am offering you a way to always find place in the program to make sure that you have no excuse. You will get to work them. Because the goal, and that's important, is to allow for mindless work to bridge volume gaps on small neglected muscle groups. What is mindless work? Mindless work is the exact opposite of what we want, meaning that it's when you just go through the motion and you don't think about it. You never want to be in that mindset when you do hard sets, but with nucleus overload, it's absolutely necessary. It needs to be mindless work because it's boring as fuck, it's low intensity, it's high reps, and it's high frequency. You better not be focused on it. Don't focus on it. Don't pump the muscle. Don't connect with the muscle. Just move the body. I guarantee you that it works. And the reason why we want that is we don't want nucleus overload to be a mentally taxing practice, because if it is, you're going to start dodging it. Nucleus overload is a vacation in Hawaii. It's a spot in the program where you know you're not going to do anything strenuous. You're just going to do a movement that doesn't look like much and allows you to just think about that girl that you saw in class, or the fact that you really want a dog, or whatever goes through your head these days. This is the way to approach it. It's absolutely necessary, okay? Don't treat it as something relevant, because it is not relevant. And by doing it as irrelevantly as possible, it's going to lead to results. I know it sounds paradoxical, but I can tell you, I can vouch that it actually works. And this mindless work is going to serve to bridge volume gaps, again, on the muscle you neglect. So, you do this much work for the calves, you know that it's not good, that you should be doing this much work, but you don't want to do it because it's boring, or you have no space, or you want to prioritize other compounds. What you're doing is you're going to find a way to put a tampon here that is going to make up for the volume gap. And what is that tampon? Nucleus overload. It's going to be the way for you to bridge that amount of work that you didn't want to do or didn't have space to do. Now you do, and it's going to be, again, seamless. It's going to be effortless. And the way I also want you to put nucleus overload on as many days as possible is, one, for flexibility, but of course, but also because you'll find that this means you'll eventually reach a hard cap 4 days, meaning that there's only so many days in the program. You can't invent new days for nucleus overload, and please don't do that. Do not create a specific day on the program where you only do nucleus overload. That's not the point. Now you're missing the point. The point is to take a day that already exists, look at spaces that are available, and put nucleus overload there. You are not to prioritize an entire day for nucleus overload. That is just a waste of your time. Again, because you're not being time efficient anymore. You're doing the exact opposite. You're now budgeting for something that we don't actually want to budget for. So, that hard cap, when it's reached, is actually going to be a good thing, because at this point, you'll have so many open sets available that volume manipulation is infinite. What do I mean? If you train 5 days a week, and on 5 days a week, you find on each day 2 or 3 spots for nucleus overload, what are the chances of you skipping it for the entire week? 0. Even if you're the laziest of the bums, you will not skip it, and that's the point. It's always going to be right there, staring in the face, saying, hey, we could be doing this right now. Like, you could be doing nucleus overload right now. And you should be doing it if you want the muscle to grow. So that's going to allow that to happen. Practical example of nucleus overload cycles. 1. Select a muscle you want to run a nucleus overload cycle on. Here, we'll select the triceps. 2. Select one isolation movement to target that muscle. Here, we'll select triceps extensions. 3. Find days in the program where the triceps don't receive any work. Here, we'll select Monday and Friday. 4. Find place on set days to incorporate a triceps superset. Here, we'll select after squats and rows. 5. look at how many sets of nucleus overload you'll have to do. Here, we'll say it's 4. 6. Now, pick a number of reps that allow for low intensity, high repeatability away from failure. 7. Select a weight that will allow you to get around that number of reps on this specific exercise. 8. After each hard set of squat and row, do your reps. Here, we'll say 15 reps with 25 pounds on triceps extension. 9. Before adding weight, see how high you can go in reps before losing on time efficiency. 10. Then, if necessary, check to see if there is another space for an additional nucleus overload superset on that day. 11. Once volume cap is hit on that day, find space on another day or similar sets can be done. 12. If every day is capped, you can start adding weight to your nucleus overload to promote time efficiency. By following that method, your volume progression is kept in check by periodic intensity spikes. 13. Rinse and repeat. Now, let's get into the practicability of the practice when it comes to muscle groups in particular. I'm going to run through the muscle groups and tell you the movements that I think to be the most effective. We're going to start with the muscle groups that make sense, aka small muscle groups, starting with the lats. Now, the lats are not technically a small muscle group, but I start with them because it's the one I have the most practice with, and it's the one that convinced me that nucleus overload works fucking wonders, even for groups that are not exactly skewed towards them because they're not that small. If you do pullovers and pull-ups for nucleus overload for the lats, you will see results. Even if with suboptimal intensity, as long as the volume and frequency is there, high volume, high frequency pullovers is the fucking truth. It will blow up your lats. It won't do it in 2 months, but do it for a straight year and come back to me. You will be amazed. And again, the way to do it is pick a weight that you can rep 25 times easily and do 7-10 reps. 7-10 reps that you're going to do like, again, 2-3 times a week for 3 or 4 sets. And it's going to feel like nothing again because it's not challenging at all, but it yields crazy results. It's the same with pull-ups. If you do something like grease the groove for the pull-ups, you already know that. Because grease the groove, at least for the people who are advanced with pull-ups, is essentially nucleus overload. It's the practice of accumulating reps that are relatively easy to get in, that are going to, at the end of the day, pile up fatigue that create results. So these 2 movements, I greatly encourage you to actually embrace. The calves, I recommend standing and sitting raises. And the calves, if you have small calves, the solution is nucleus overload. Because we both know that you're not going to do your hard sets of calves. No one gets amped up for it. The beautiful thing about nucleus overload is that you don't need to be amped up. You can be hangover, tired and depressed. You can still do nucleus overload because strength doesn't matter. That's also the beauty of nucleus overload is you won't have a day where you'll come in and say, oh, my CNS is shot, so I can't do my cycle of NO. No, it's 30% intensity away from failure. You can do that every single day of your life. Even the day you die, you'll still do your nucleus overload cycle. So for calves, standing and sitting raises, again, 10 to 15 reps. You can go to failure if you want or if you don't. It doesn't matter. Just multiply the sets, multiply the days where you do the sets, and do, again, medium to high reps. You will see results. It's the best way to train calves. Training them heavy has its place, but it cannot be the bulk of your training. In this case, I would actually say that skewing the training of the calves, mainly through nucleus overload, is the way to go. And the next muscle group is the same, forearms. Forearms were built with in mind the fact that the best way to grow them is nucleus overload. There's a reason why the biggest forearms you see on non-bodybuilders are on welders and on arm wrestlers. Why do you think that is? Look at the training of an arm wrestler. It's a shit ton of volume, it's a shit ton of sets to develop the ability of pronation or supination of movements of the wrist, which trains the forearms. Same for welders. You think welders do hard sets? You think they grab something that's 500 pounds and they do 1 rep? No, they just move shit all day long. They hit, they manipulate the wrist, and that creates growth. So we want to replicate that. And we want to replicate that through wrist and finger curls. I especially recommend trying finger curls If you're the type of person that has wrist pain, it did wonders for my wrist in particular. You can do holds and dead hangs as well if you want. The issue with holds is that it's going to impact your grip strength. So if you're the type who uses it for your actual strength work on pause, you're going to have a problem. Of course, if you use straps, the issue is a non-issue now. I want to make sure also that you don't hyper-focus on strength and say, well, if I do NO for my forearm, I won't have strength for the grip. It won't happen if you actually manage recovery or if you just use straps. Special mention for the grippers. The grippers are a great way to nucleus overload the forearms. You can just do them 2 to 3 times a week, again for 3 or 4 sets of medium reps without going to failure, and it's not going to burn you out, quite the opposite. For dead hangs, I'm a little bit more concerned because they have a tendency to really fatigue the forearm. So you can either do them away from failure, so you don't wait for the forearm or the ends to give up, to stop, or you do them once or twice a week at the end of the lower body day without overdoing it. For traps, shrugs. Shrugs, shrugs, shrugs. The best way to do NO for the traps is going to be shrugs. Shrugs can fit anywhere in the program. You grab dumbbells, you grab a barbell, and you just shrug it off. Even if it's not going to be a weight that is going to be challenging, 15 to like 17 or 10 to 15 reps for 3 or 4 sets, 3 times a week is going to yield result. It is going to actually blow up your traps, so try it. For the triceps, I recommend extensions in priority. Don't do compound movements. A close grip bench press is not a good movement for nucleus overload for the triceps. You want to do band extensions, you want to do cable extensions behind the head, etc. For the long head, for the medial and the lateral head, it is the exact same thing. And you will find also that if you do it intelligently, it will not damage your ability to perform on presses. For shoulders, elevation. Again, no presses, no overhead press. You're going to do real dart flies, you're going to do lateral raises, medial raises, Egyptian raises, whatever you want to call them, just do that. It, again, has a very small cost. It's very effective in terms of fatigue to stimulus ratio. If you know how to do them, it's not going to damage the shoulder joint, and it's going to work. For the abs, crunches, leg raises, you know the deal. It's the way to go. Isolation for the abs. And actually, the abs is a little bit like the forearms. I think that the most optimal way to train the abs is every single day. Every single day, a few sets that don't actually get you to failure, that don't really fatigue you. You're not going to be like bent in half because you're going to have like 6-pack soreness the next day. You'll just have worked it a little bit, and every single day you work it a little bit, and that's the way to actually achieve good results if you run nucleus overload. For the neck, you're going to do curls. Do not do neck bridges for nucleus overload. Neck bridges are not bad, but they are too skewed towards potential fatigue accumulation. We want curls. Curls away from fatigue. Curls with a bend. Bend with your head like this is going to blow up your neck as well. For the bicep, it's going to be a similar type of methodology. You're going to do elastic band curls. The issue if you do actual curls with a dumbbell or a barbell for bicep nucleus overload, even if you are far from failure, even if you do, again, a small contained amount of rep, is that the bicep has a tendency to develop tendinitis, especially with straight weights. I have found that this is not true with elastic bands. You're going to get all of the benefits of nucleus overload for the bicep without all of the inconvenience. And that actually wraps up the nucleus overload practices for these small muscle groups of the body. Now, let's look at the big muscle groups, the one that I do not recommend you to nucleus overload for all of the reasons that I already described. It just is not applicable. But if you are to do it this way. For quads, leg extensions, no knee flexions, maybe CC squats, but even that, the issue with a compound movement for the legs is that you're going to recruit other muscles as well, which is not the point of nucleus overload. So leg extensions. For the hammies, same logic, no hip hinges. Leg curls. For the glutes, same thing. I don't know why you would want to nucleus overload your glutes, since it's a group that just gets fed every single lower body movement regardless. It's the reason why these muscles don't make any sense to overload like this, is that they get hit on every single compound. But if that's what you want, glutes, hip thrust. If you want a gorilla ass and gorilla glutes, you can nucleus overload via hip thrust. For the chest, which might be the one muscle group that I would understand why people want to nucleus overload it. Many people have a weak point in their chest. You can do flies. Do not involve the shoulder joint. Do not involve the tricep. You want to keep it as isolation-y as possible. So chest flies, ring flies will do the work. Again, away from failure, you don't want to actually injure your pectoral tendon. That is not the point. And for upper back, which is really an amalgamation of muscles, as I told you, you can do the lats in the fashion I described previously, but for the rest, if you want to grow the thickness of the back, the mid-back, you can do ring rows and even dumbbell rows. Now, dumbbell rows is a little bit of an exception because you would think that it's a type of movement that is too fatigue-inducing, but I have found that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is really great. So if you do it with like 40-50% of your max and you just, again, do it away from failure, it is possible to do NO for the upper back with dumbbell rows. It's actually something that I recommend because it works quite well. Or ring rows, as I said. And then the last one, the one that if you do Nucleus Overload 4, you might have to check yourself in a mental institution because it makes no sense. The lower back. The lower back is the one part of the body that we constantly look at as the limiting factor. It's always the one that is always fatigued. So I don't know why you would want to specifically target fatigue in this area, but if you do bridges, just do static bridges for the lower back, and that is going to take care of that. And this concludes the list of practices for every muscle group for Nucleus Overload. Now, I want to finish with a few pointers to conclude so as to make sure you don't fuck up. First off, Nucleus Overload is not for beginners because a beginner has only weak points. You have no use for Nucleus Overload. You have to focus on hard sets and hard sets only. We do not want your attention to be divided. It needs to be only on your ability to do compounds and isolation in relevant intensity windows. Once you learn that skill, you will know enough about recovery to do Nucleus Overload. So Nucleus Overload is for late novices, early intermediates, and forward. And the more advanced you are in bodybuilding, the more Nucleus Overload you can do. If you're just a late novice, do one muscle group, okay? Don't make that mistake of doing a ton of NO and having a shitty program because keep in mind that NO is something that takes a lot of auto-regulation, of understanding your body so as to not fuck up with fatigue accumulation, and an ability to control volume manipulation. So if you can do that, it's not going to work. 2, don't let Nucleus Overload turn into straight sets. It's the old tale of the guy who does bicep curls and before he knows it, he's cheating. It's the tale of the guy who does strict rows and before he knows it, he's doing rubbish rows with his back, doing this and the legs being involved. It's also possible to have that happen with Nucleus Overload that devolves into straight sets because you're going to focus too much on strength progression. Strength progression is not the priority. It's at the bottom of the pyramid when it comes to the way to program. Strength expenditure is not something to be considered when it comes to Nucleus Overload. Nucleus Overload is, again, an afterthought. Never think of Nucleus Overload in that fashion. That is reserved for the rest of the program. 3, don't replace volume from hard sets by Nucleus Overload ever, never, ever. Nucleus Overload is an addition. It is the star atop the Christmas tree, not the base. Keep that in mind because if not, you're going to end up with a star put on the ground with no tree. And that doesn't look like anything at all. It's actually the way a lot of bodybuilders train where they only do something that resembles Nucleus Overload, which is completely irrelevant sets, and they look like total garbage when they're not on drugs. So don't fall for the same mistake. And the 4th one, and the one that is more connected to the psychology of Nucleus Overload. Nucleus Overload is a project. It's something that you're going to have to experience for yourself. It's something that I found myself. Now that I've run it, I understand what it is. But beforehand, I also did. But I only knew the theory. Now that I have the practice, it makes a ton more sense. So to make sure that you can get to the same level I'm at, where you finally get to understand why it works so well, don't do it all at once. Don't try to do 3 Nucleus Overload cycles at once because it's going to bore the fuck out of you. Nucleus Overload is tiring, it's boring. Mentally speaking, it's not challenging. And I know that a ton of you guys, if something is not challenging in the gym, if it's not a hard set, you already don't do it. It's the reason why so many people shun isolation is because it's not as fun as compound movement. It's the reason why so many people love going to failure is because it's, again, thrilling, it's exciting. Nucleus Overload is the exact opposite. It's not intense, you don't even come anywhere close to failure. So if you do 3 at once, guess what? You're going to do hundreds of boring reps, it's going to disgust you from the practice, and you're going to stop. It's the reason why so many people don't train their small muscle groups, is because they've made that mistake. So start with one so that you can allow it to prove to yourself that it works. because I can tell you one thing. Once you realize how well it works, now even if it's the most boring thing in the world, you'll still do it. When I see the results it has on my lats, now I can do it peacefully for calves, for forearms, and for triceps because I know it's gonna work. I have seen the results. You haven't seen the results. Even if you trust me, until your body feels what it means, you won't have that security in you that it's gonna work. Because again, keep in mind that NO is still an investment. You still invest time and energy into doing something. If it didn't work, you wouldn't want to do it. It's the reason why so many people say NO doesn't work, is because they never got to that point. So again, start with one. Once you have that one cycle that worked out, you can add another, then another. You have to do it because you're going to have to get your body and your mind to accept the mindless repetition of nucleus overload. If you cannot go past that, you cannot actually grab the results. Nucleus overload is not something that gets you results in 2 months. It's a project that takes years and years, but it does work, and it does, in a sense, give you results for nothing. Because again, you pay nothing. It would be the equivalent of putting a penny or a quarter in a jar every single day of your life. It doesn't feel like a big investment, but at the end of the day, you still accumulate money. I think it would be more relevant with $1 or $2, but you get where I'm coming from. And just like that, we are concluding this video on nucleus overload. So I hope it was informative. I hope I'm convincing you to give it a try, and I hope that I covered every single aspect to make sure that the practice is understood, that you don't fuck up, and that you actually apply it in your training to see the results that you deserve, to see the amount of biohacking that is possible when it comes to muscle growth. When we understand the body, we understand fatigue accumulation, and we know how to actually bypass it to make it as optimal as possible. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.